She had never seen mountains before that morning, the kind that rose like old gods out of the mist, their tops still capped with snow even though spring was already waking the valleys below. The wagon jolted beneath her as it climbed the narrow trail, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air, and every turn of the road seemed to carry her farther from the world she'd known, and deeper into something wild and ancient. 19 years old and untouched by much more than prairie wind and prayer, Clara May Turner clutched her shawl close around her shoulders, feeling the letter from her father tucked safely inside her pocket, the letter that had sent her to this place, to the man she'd been promised to. The mountain man. Her father had called it a blessing, though his eyes had been tired when he'd said it. The drought had burned their crops. The bank had come for the land, and there was little left for a daughter who could neither work the fields like a son, nor be fed when there was no bread. He's a good man, her father had told her. Strong, honest, lives up there alone, says he needs a wife to tend his home. And though Clara's heart had trembled with the thought of being given to a stranger, she'd nodded because that was what a daughter did. She'd grown up with the belief that obedience was a form of love. As the wagon rolled higher, the air grew sharp and pine-scented, and she could hear the distant cry of hawks echoing off the cliffs. The driver, a quiet old man named Jed, glanced at her from time to time but said little. Folks in town whispered about the man she was bound for, said he was half-wild himself. A giant who'd left civilization after the war, choosing the mountains over men. Some called him cursed. Others said he'd saved travelers from bears and blizzards alike. Clara didn't know which to believe. She only knew that she was being sent to be his wife, and that the silence of the mountains pressed against her chest until she thought her heart might burst. When the wagon could go no farther, Jed pulled the reins and nodded toward a narrow path that disappeared into the woods. "This here's where I leave you, miss," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Cabin's about a mile yonder, past the creek. He'll be waitin'." Clara climbed down, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She gathered her small carpet bag, her only belongings inside, a Bible, a brush, and a dress her mother had sewn before she passed. For a long moment she stood there, watching as the wagon rolled back down the trail, the sound of hooves fading until there was only the wind whispering through the pines. She'd never felt so alone nor so small. The path was narrow and shadowed, winding between towering firs. The air smelled of moss and cold water. Every rustle in the underbrush made her start, and she found herself whispering little prayers beneath her breath. Yet there was beauty here too. The way sunlight speared through the trees in gold threads, the music of a brook nearby, the scent of wildflowers beginning to bloom. It felt as though she'd stepped into another world, one older and truer than the one she'd left behind. At last, she came to a clearing. Smoke curled gently from a chimney, and before her stood a cabin built of thick logs, sturdy and weathered but tidy. A corral stretched beyond it, and a large black horse lifted its head, watching her with dark, curious eyes. For a long time she could only stand there, her heart pounding. She thought of turning back, but there was nowhere to go. Then the door opened, and she saw him. He filled the doorway like a figure carved from the mountain itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark beard that touched his chest and hair that looked sunburnt brown. His eyes were pale, piercing, the color of cold river water. He didn't speak at first, only studied her as though trying to understand why something so small and fragile had wandered to his door. The silence stretched between them, heavy and alive. "You're Clara?" he finally asked, his voice deep, roughened by years of solitude. She swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir. My father, he sent me. Said you—" "I know what he said." He stepped forward, boots crunching on the frost-bitten grass. He was even taller than she'd imagined, towering over her by more than a head, his hands scarred and strong. Yet there was something careful in the way he looked at her, as though he feared his size might frighten her. "Name's Elias Boone," he said. "Ain't much up here but the land and the work. If you're staying, you'll find it hard." "I can work," Clara said softly. "And I mean to stay." For a moment something like surprise flickered in his eyes, then softened into something quieter. He nodded once. "Reckon we'll see." He turned and held the door open for her. She stepped inside, her heart trembling. The cabin smelled of pine wood and smoke, with shelves lined neatly, a fire burning low in the hearth, and a handmade quilt folded across the bed in the corner. It was rough but clean, and there was a certain gentleness in the way everything was arranged, as though the man who lived here, for all his size and solitude, still cared for the things around him. Elias closed the door behind her, and the sound seemed to mark the end of her old life and the beginning of something unknown. She felt his presence close behind her, quiet but immense. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the mountains stood watch, vast, eternal, and waiting. Clara didn't know yet that she had just stepped into the kind of love that would one day make the whole town whisper her name in wonder. All she knew then was that the mountains were vast. The man before her was both fearsome and kind, and her heart had already begun to stir with something she didn't yet have a name for. Elias Boone had lived alone in those mountains for near 7 years before the girl came. 7 winters of snow piling high against the cabin door. 7 springs of watching the meltwater roar down the gullies, carving new scars into the land. He had come up here to escape noise, the kind made by men and the kind made by thoughts that never quieted when the world below was full of greed and gunfire. Out here there was only the whisper of wind through the pines, the creak of his axe, the call of an owl at dusk. He had grown used to the language of solitude until it was all he spoke. And he'd thought he would die that way, with the mountain as his only witness. When he first heard the wagon creaking down the trail that morning, he'd felt it before he saw it, an unfamiliar vibration in the ground, something human and small making its way up the wild ridges. He hadn't expected she'd actually come. Men down in town had joked about it. Boone's taken a wife, and he'd ignored them, certain the girl's father would come to his senses before sending her up. But then the sound of the wagon faded, and in its place came the faint crunch of footsteps, light and uncertain, and he'd known it was true. When he opened that cabin door and saw her standing there, he forgot the words he'd meant to say. She looked like something the mountain itself might have dreamed, a slip of a girl, pale and soft, her hair catching what little sunlight broke through the pines. Her eyes, wide as new dawn, held a kind of quiet courage that surprised him. He'd expected fear. Instead, she met his gaze like someone who'd already made peace with her fate. And though she was barely more than a wisp in his doorway, Elias felt the still air around them shift, as if the land itself was listening. He didn't know how to speak gentle anymore. His voice, rough as the bark of the pines, came out harder than he meant. But she didn't flinch. When she said she meant to stay, he believed her. That was the first thing that stirred something inside him, a respect that felt close to awe. After she stepped inside, he busied himself with small things, stirring the fire, hanging her shawl, offering water from the spring bucket. He was clumsy with it, aware of how large his hands looked beside hers. She thanked him in a soft voice that seemed to melt the edges off the silence. He wasn't used to another person's presence. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too full of the sound of her breathing, the rustle of her skirts. For the first time in years, Elias didn't know what to do with himself. He told himself she'd probably last a week before begging to go back. Most did when they learned what living up here truly meant. There were storms that could snap a tree in half, nights when the wolves came too close, days when the only warmth was what you made with your own hands. But when he watched her that evening, kneeling by the hearth to warm herself, a strand of her hair glowing in the firelight, he had a strange feeling she might surprise him. That first night, he took the cot by the wall and let her have the bed. She'd offered to switch, said it didn't feel right, but he'd shaken his head. A man don't put a guest on the floor, he'd said. Truth was, he wasn't sure he trusted himself to sleep too close to her. Not in the way of temptation, he wasn't the kind of man who'd force what wasn't freely given, but because her presence stirred something long buried. He'd lived too long without touch, without the sound of another voice beside his own. He feared that if he let himself get used to it, he'd never be able to go back to the silence again. He lay awake that night listening to the storm outside, the wind keening through the trees, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was a sound so tender it hurt to hear. He thought about what kind of girl she must be to leave behind everything she knew and walk into the wild for a man she'd never met. Brave or desperate or both. Either way, she'd come willingly. That mattered. In the days that followed, she tried to help. He watched her gather water from the creek, hang his shirts to dry, sweep the cabin with a birch broom she'd fashioned herself. She was clumsy at first, spilled water, burned bread, but she never complained. There was a quiet pride about her, the kind that reminded him of wildflowers growing from stone. And sometimes when she laughed, soft and startled like she didn't quite remember how. Elias found himself smiling without meaning to. He caught himself watching her more often than was decent. When she brushed her hair by the window at dawn, the light catching on the strands like spun honey. When she sat by the fire at night, reading aloud from that little Bible of hers, her voice low and sure. It wasn't desire that drew him at first, but peace, the kind he hadn't felt since he was a boy, before the world taught him to hide from it. Still, he didn't know what to do with her presence. He was a man who built fences and felled trees, not one who spoke sweet words or knew how to court a woman. So he worked harder, fixed the roof, cut extra firewood, hunted farther out, telling himself he did it for her sake. Though deep down he knew it was because the work kept him from thinking too much. Sometimes he caught her looking at him, her gaze soft and curious as though she were studying a creature she couldn't quite name. And when their eyes met, something flickered there, something that felt like warmth breaking through a long winter. Elias Boone had never thought himself a man fit for tenderness. But that girl in his cabin, with her quiet ways and her unshaken faith, began to teach him otherwise without ever meaning to. Each day she was there, the silence that had once been his comfort began to feel like a thing that no longer fit. He didn't say the words aloud, not yet. But by the end of that first week, he knew if she chose to leave, the mountains would never sound the same again. By the third week, the cabin had begun to feel like something alive. The chill that once settled in its corners was replaced by warmth from the fire that never seemed to die, and from something else, something that grew each day between them, like sunlight creeping into the dark. Clara had learned the rhythm of the place, the hiss of the kettle at dawn, the sound of Elias's axe echoing through the trees, the smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with bread baking on the hearth. She moved through his world as though she'd always belonged, though each time he watched her he still couldn't quite believe she was real. It was the small things that undid him, the way she hummed while hanging laundry by the creek, sleeves rolled past her elbows, sunlight brushing her skin golden, the way she laughed softly when the old rooster tried to chase her from the yard, the way she'd pause beside him while he worked, offering water or simply standing near. Her presence quiet but steady. Elias had known every sound this land could make. The cry of hawks, the sigh of wind, but her voice was different. It filled the silence without breaking it. He began to teach her the ways of the mountain, patient and careful. How to set traps without scaring the rabbits. How to read the clouds for snow. How to chop kindling without splintering it. She'd smile at his instruction, her brow furrowed in determination, and though her hands blistered and her muscles ached, she never complained. "You'll do," he'd say in that low voice of his, and she'd beam as if he'd given her the world. Sometimes she'd catch him looking at her, that unguarded look that made her heart trip in her chest. He was a man of few words, but the things he didn't say seemed to linger in the air between them, things that burned low and steady, like embers that refused to die. Clara had come expecting hardness, maybe even cruelty. Instead, she found a man who moved through life with quiet strength, who spoke little but listened deeply, who built warmth from wood and patience. At night, the mountains grew still and strange, their silence deeper than the world below could ever imagine. The firelight danced on the cabin walls, casting their shadows long and soft. Elias would sit by the hearth whittling or mending tools while she sewed or read aloud. Sometimes he'd ask her to read again. Even when he didn't care much for the words, he just liked the sound of her voice, the gentle rise and fall that made the roughness of his days smooth again. It was one of those nights when the first real warmth passed between them. The wind was howling outside, snow beginning to fall again, though it was spring down in the valley. She was by the fire, trying to mend a tear in her dress, and the thread snapped for the third time. Her fingers trembled from the cold, and she sighed in frustration. Elias, watching from his chair, rose quietly. He knelt beside her, his hands rough and scarred, and took the cloth gently from her fingers. "Let me," he said. His voice was soft, almost uncertain. She looked up, startled by how close he was. The firelight caught his face, the strong line of his jaw, the tired kindness in his eyes, and something in her chest fluttered. He took the needle in his great hands, his movements careful as though he were handling something precious. His fingers brushed hers once, and the touch lingered. "You've got steady hands," she whispered, her voice barely there. He gave a faint, almost shy smile. They weren't always. They sat like that for a long moment, the storm whispering outside. the only sound inside the cabin the crackle of the fire and their own quiet breaths. When he handed the mended cloth back to her, their hands touched again, and this time neither of them pulled away. From that night on, something changed. The distance that had once lived between them began to shrink. When she brushed past him in the doorway, his hand would sometimes find the small of her back, steadying her. When he poured her coffee in the morning, she'd smile and touch his wrist in thanks, her fingers lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't bold what passed between them. It was gentle and growing, like spring thawing the last of the winter ice. One evening, after a long day of rain, the sun broke through just before dusk. The world outside glowed golden green, steam rising off the wet earth. Clara stepped out onto the porch, letting the last light warm her face. Elias came up behind her, quiet as ever, and for a moment they simply stood there listening to the soft hum of the forest. Then, without a word, he draped his old wool coat around her shoulders. "You'll catch a chill," he murmured. She turned to look at him. "You worry more than you let on." "Maybe." His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable, and yet she could feel everything in them. The restraint, the longing, the wonder of it all. The moment stretched. Then slowly she reached up, her fingers brushing his beard, the line of his cheek. It was a brave thing to do, but it felt right. Like the mountains themselves had paused to hold their breath. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He only looked at her with a kind of reverence, as though he'd never been touched in kindness before. When he finally reached for her, it wasn't hurried or rough. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her cheek. "Clara," he said her name like it was something holy. She didn't answer with words. Her eyes closed and she leaned into his touch. And in that quiet, he bent down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was the slow, trembling kind born of loneliness and wonder. The meeting of two lives that had been walking toward this one moment for years without knowing it. The fire crackled softly behind them, and the light faded from the sky, leaving only the scent of rain and pine and the warmth of their breath mingling in the cold air. When they parted, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You're not as wild as they say," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "And you're not as fragile as they think." That night the mountains seemed to hum around them, ancient and approving. For the first time in all his years, Elias Boone went to sleep with someone else's heartbeat near his own, and he dreamed not of solitude, but of home. The mountain could be gentle when it wished, but it was never tame. By midsummer, the days grew longer and the air thick with the scent of pine and wild grass, and Clara thought she had begun to understand its moods. She could tell when the wind carried rain or when the clouds meant frost. But even the old hands down in the valley said no one truly knew the mountains, least of all when the storms came. It was near the end of July when the weather turned sudden. The morning had dawned clear, the sky pale blue and harmless. Elias had gone up the ridge before sunrise to check his snares and fell some cedar, leaving Clara to tend the garden and the fire. By noon the air felt strange, heavy, restless. The birds went silent. She looked up from her washing and saw the first dark clouds crawling over the peaks like bruises spreading across the sky. By the time she gathered the laundry and ran for the cabin, the wind had begun to roar. Branches cracked overhead. The scent of lightning burned sharp in the air. She barred the door and fed the fire, telling herself he'd come back soon. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the storm broke full over the mountain, thunder rolling like gunfire through the valley. She pressed her hands to the window. Watching the rain lash the world white, and fear took hold. Deep, cold fear that he might not make it home. When the door finally burst open, wind howling in with him, she nearly cried out from relief. He was soaked through, his coat torn, his arm bleeding where a falling branch had caught him. "Elias." She ran to him, helping him out of his coat, her fingers trembling. He grunted, waved her off, but she wouldn't have it. She fetched water and a clean rag, scolding him through her tears. "You shouldn't have gone so far," she said. "You should have come back sooner." "Clara," he said, quiet but firm. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. His shoulder was cut deep and he winced when she touched it. She washed the blood away, biting her lip to keep her hands steady. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the walls, but she could hear his heartbeat under her palm, steady and real. When she looked up, their eyes met, and something in her broke open. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. He didn't speak. He just reached out, his rough hand curling around hers. "You won't," he said. That should have been the end of it. The storm passing, their bond sealed deeper. But the next morning brought another kind of trouble. A rider came from town. A wiry man with a scar on his cheek and news that traveled fast. He brought supplies, yes, but also words sharp enough to cut. "Heard tell your girl down there was promised to another before her pa sent her up here," the man said, glancing toward Clara as she stood in the doorway. "Some storekeeper's son. She run off, they say, to keep from marrying him." Elias didn't answer right away. He only looked at Clara. Something shuddered behind his eyes. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up. The rider gave a smirk, tipped his hat, and left her shame echoing in his wake. Inside the cabin, the silence was worse than thunder. "Is it true?" Elias asked finally. Clara swallowed. "Part of it," she said softly. "My father wanted me to marry that man. He said it would save the farm. But I couldn't marry someone who didn't love me. So when you sent word you needed a wife, my father agreed." She looked down, tears brimming. "I didn't run away from duty, Elias. I came because I wanted to belong somewhere. With someone honest, but his face was unreadable. You should have told me." "I didn't think it mattered." "It does," he said, turning away. "You should have known what kind of man you were coming to. I don't take kindly to lies, even small ones." The words cut deeper than any storm. She stood there, her heart hollowing. "Then maybe you don't know what kind of woman you took in," she whispered. He didn't answer, and the silence between them cracked like ice underfoot. That night he slept outside under the lean-to, saying the cabin needed airing after the rain. But she knew it wasn't the air that needed clearing. It was his trust. The next morning dawned gray. She couldn't bear the cabin's emptiness, so she took a basket and went into the woods, thinking to gather herbs for his wound, or maybe just to breathe where the air wasn't heavy with hurt. She wandered farther than she meant to, her thoughts a tangle of sorrow and stubborn pride. She didn't notice the storm clouds building again until it was too late. The rain came sudden, cold, and fierce. The trail turned to mud, the trees bending under the wind. She tried to find her way back, but every direction looked the same. Then she heard it, the low growl, close and deep. She turned, and there in the dim light stood a bear, massive and gray, its eyes fixed on her. She froze. Her heart hammered so loud it drowned the storm. She stumbled back, tripped, and fell hard against the wet earth. The bear took a step forward, huffing, its breath hot and foul. She remembered Elias's words, "Don't run, don't scream, stand your ground," but her legs wouldn't move. Then came a shout, his voice fierce and clear through the wind. Elias burst through the trees, rifle in hand, soaked and wild-eyed. "Clara!" The bear swung its head toward him, roaring. He fired once, the sound splitting the storm, and the creature lunged before vanishing into the woods. The echo of it faded, leaving only the hiss of rain and her ragged breathing. He was beside her in an instant, hauling her up, his hands shaking as he checked her for wounds. "You all right? Tell me you're all right." She nodded, tears mixing with the rain. I got lost." He pulled her against him then, his chest warm even through his soaked shirt. "Don't you ever do that again," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't you ever walk away from me like that." She clung to him, sobbing. "You walked away first," he stilled, his breath catching. Then he cupped her face in his hands, rough thumbs brushing her tears. "I was a fool," he said. "You told the truth. I just didn't want to believe it mattered that much to me. But it does. You do." The storm raged on around them, but neither noticed. He kissed her then, not careful this time, but with the fierce, aching relief of a man who'd nearly lost the only thing that mattered. She melted against him, every fear and hurt washing away in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, the rain had begun to ease, the clouds breaking just enough for a sliver of light to find them. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the mountains steaming in the aftermath of the storm. The wild had tested them, and they had come through not as two strangers bound by need, but as something far stronger, two souls bound by choice. By autumn, the mountains had turned to gold. The aspens blazed like fire across the slopes, the air crisp and sweet with wood smoke and wild apples. Down in the valley, folks said the first snows would come early this year, but up where Elias and Clara lived, time moved slower, softer. The storms had passed, both the ones made of rain and the ones made of hearts, and the little cabin now held a peace so deep that even the wind seemed to move more gently through the pines. Every morning, Elias woke before dawn the way he always had, but now, when he rose from the bed, he did it carefully so as not to wake the woman sleeping beside him. She would stir, sometimes smile in her dreams, and he would stand there for a moment just watching her in the half-light, unable to believe that she was real. The man who had once spoken only to trees and fire now had a voice that knew her name like a prayer. Clara, for her part, had learned the mountain's rhythms until they sang in her bones. She knew which log creaked in the floor when Elias stepped through the door, which whistle meant coffee was ready, which look meant he was about to tease her in that rare, quiet way that always made her blush. She had come here as a girl afraid of her own fate. She had become a woman who shaped it with her own 2 hands. Sometimes, on calm evenings, they would sit on the porch together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the light fade off the peaks. He would carve little things for her, buttons, trinkets, a wooden bird she once said reminded her of home, and she would hum old songs her mother used to sing. They didn't need many words. The silence between them had changed. It no longer meant loneliness. It meant belonging. The people down in town talked, of course. They said the girl who'd been sent to tame the mountain man had done it, though not by force nor by fear. Some said she'd bewitched him. Others said he'd saved her from the wild and made her into something else. But those who saw them together on the rare days they came down for supplies knew the truth. It was not taming nor saving. It was something mutual and quiet and steady as the earth beneath their feet. When Elias would ride into town with Clara behind him on the black horse, heads would turn. She'd wear a simple shawl and that soft, shy smile of hers, and he, the giant mountain man who once had no use for company, would glance down at her as though she were the only light in the room. The blacksmith once joked, "Never thought I'd see Boone brought to heel." Elias had only smiled, a slow, knowing kind of smile. "Ain't that," he said. "Just found something worth standing still for." That winter, when the first heavy snow came, they were ready. The cabin was stocked, the woodpile high. The storm howled for 3 days straight, white swallowing the world, but inside there was laughter and warmth. Clara baked bread while Elias mended tools, their hands brushing often, each touch a word they didn't need to speak. When the wind rattled the windows, she would lean into him by the fire, and he'd wrap his arm around her, holding her as though the whole mountain could crumble and he'd still keep her safe. On the 3rd night, as the storm began to ease, she stood by the hearth, watching the flames dance across his face. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed in town?" she asked softly. He looked up from his work, surprised. "What for?" "There's people there," she said, smiling faintly. "Noise. Roads that don't disappear in snow." He chuckled low, set his tools aside, and walked to her. "I had all that once," he said. "Didn't do me much good. Up here, I got this." He touched her cheek gently, rough thumb tracing the corner of her smile. "And that's more than enough." She leaned into his hand, her heart full. "Then you're not lonely anymore?" He shook his head, his eyes soft as winter dusk. "Not since the day you came up that trail." Outside, the snow drifted down slow and quiet, blanketing the world in white. Inside, they built another log on the fire, and the cabin glowed like a lantern in the dark, a promise kept. A home built not from wood and stone alone, but from trust. Spring came again, and with it the valley thawed. The creeks roared with meltwater, and wildflowers returned to the slopes. Clara planted a small garden beside the cabin, laughing when Elias pretended not to care about her foolish flower patch, though she'd catch him watching the blossoms with that same half-smile he used when he looked at her. By the time the next summer came, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop at the old trail's fork and point toward the ridge, where smoke rose gentle from a single cabin. "That's Boone's place," they'd say. "Man used to live up there like a bear, till some slip of a girl came along and made him human again." But those who climbed high enough to see for themselves always said the same thing, that they found not a tamed man nor a caged woman, but 2 souls who had built a life as wild and enduring as the land itself. One evening, long after the sun had set and the crickets were singing, Elias sat on the porch steps with Clara beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. The stars spilled like silver dust across the sky. He took her hand in his, their fingers interlacing the way roots hold to earth. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "All those years I thought the mountain was enough. Turns out it was just waiting for you." Clara smiled, her voice soft as the wind. "And I think maybe I was waiting for you too." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment everything, the scars of the past, the whispers from town, the wildness of the world, faded away. There was only her face in the starlight and the sound of their hearts, steady and sure, and there, high above the world, in the hush of the mountain night, they kissed again, slow and certain, as though sealing the truth of what they had built. A love so simple and strong that even time itself would pause to listen. Long after, the people in town still told the story, how the giant mountain man and the pure-hearted girl had made a home in the wilderness, how she taught him to speak softly again, and how he, in turn, showed her what it meant to be truly free. And whenever the wind blew down from the peaks, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke, some swore they could still hear laughter in it, the echo of two souls who had found forever in a place where no one thought love could survive.